Hello, my name is Jessica Pipkin, and this is an oral presentation for Dr. Stephen Fuller's World Literature course at Middle Georgia State University. This presentation is on Francesco Petrarca, known as Petrarch. Francesco Petrarch was born to Pietro di Parenzo and Iletta Canigiani on July 20th of 1304. A year prior to his birth, his parents lived in Florence, where his father was a member of the White Guelette Party. The White Guelette Party was overtaken by the Black Guelette Party, and Petrarch's father was found guilty of treason, and he was sentenced to exile from Florence, and his parents settled in Arezzo, Tuscany, which was where Petrarch was born, and 3 years later, his brother, in 1307, Gerardo, was born. About a year after Gerardo's birth, his mother, with Petrarch and Gerardo, moved to Incessa. However, Incessa was still under Florence rule, and his father could not openly be with them. After a while, they then settled and moved to Avignon. And in Avignon, they were able to be together, and his father had a prominent legal profession there. In 1316, at the age of 12, Petrarch began to study law at the University of Montpellier. He studied law there for 4 years, and his mother passed away during those 4 years. Then in 1320, he moved to Bologna, and there he's continued his pursuit of law for 3 more years. There in Bologna, however, Petrarch was exposed to vernacular poetry, or poetry that was written in Italian instead of Latin. And Petrarch fell in love with the vernacular poetry, and many of his poems, and some of those for which he is most well known, were written in the vernacular poetry style. His father passed away, and in 1326 he and his brother moved back to Avignon, and at that time Petrarch was able to more openly pursue his love of literature and of Latin and classical literature. And it was in Avignon a year later, after he and his brother had moved back there in 1327, on April the 6th, which was Good Friday, he and his brother were attending church at St. Clair. And there he met or saw Laura for the first time, and he fell in love with Laura. Laura became, or was, his ideal woman. She was ideal in every aspect, in her morality, in her spirituality, and just the person, her personification of herself. He esteemed Laura greatly, and she influenced many of his writings. In fact, most of his poems that are written in the Italian vernacular are inspired or about Laura. He wrote many about her prior to her death, and then many about her even after her death in 1348, when she passed away of the plague. These poems, there was 366 of them in all, that were collected in a collection called the Canzoniere, or rhymes. And in these rhymes, you can see how much he loved and esteemed Laura, even though they had some would call a poetic, distant type of relationship. There were questions as to whether Laura was even a real person, but Petrarch was so moved by meeting her that he had a copy of Virgil, and that was kind of like his diary. And in the margin in Virgil, he wrote the date and where he met Laura that first time, and then also about her passing into the margin. And even though at the time people wondered if Laura was even real or something that Petrarch had imagined of, but he insisted that she was a real person. This here is a picture of Petrarch, and this is a picture of who is believed to have been his Laura. While Laura inspired many of his works, Petrarch also wrote a lot of other works, and in 1330 he accompanied his friend Giacomo Colonna, who was the Bishop of Lombez, to Lombez, and the Colonna family served as kind of a patriarch to uh, Petrarch, and they were a patron, not a patriarch, sorry, a patron to Petrarch, and he was able to pursue his literary career. And while there with the Bishop of Lombez, he received his first clerical appointment as chaplain to the Cardinal Giovanni Colonna. And in 1333, he traveled. He had a lot, and he ended up in Vaucluse. And there he lived sporadically in Vaucluse until 1353. In 1336, he climbed Mount Vento with his brother, which Mount Vento was in an area near where he grew up, and it was supposedly very beautiful. And the climb was a bit of a physical struggle. I mean, he was climbing a mountain. But he also writes about during that climb how not only was it physically challenging, but he had an internal struggle going on about his desire for worldly fame and his desire for spirituality. And in a lot of his writings, you can see the struggle that he had between his choice to pursue worldly fame and over spirituality. But Petrarch was in 1340. He hinted that he wanted to be crowned or with the laurel, which was a coronation that took place for great poets during their time. And in 1341, I believe it was September, he was, in September of 1340 is when he received 2 invitations for coronation, one from the University of Paris and one from the Synod of Rome. Petrarch chose to have his coronation and accepted the invitation from Rome, and there in the winter of 1341 he was crowned with a laurel wreath, and he gave his coronation speech, which he wrote. His speech was inspired by Virgil, and he wrote about the poetry and the importance of poetry instead of his inspiration, like I said, came from Virgil instead of coming from scriptural reference. In 1353, he moved to Milan, and there he served the various lords of the land. It says from Colvin, and there he had more time to write. Petrarch drew a lot of his inspiration from nature. It said that he really loved to retreat to more rural areas, even though he served for several years as a diplomat throughout Europe and for different prominent political and religious leaders during that time. In 1361, he left Milan because of the plague, and he then moved to Padua and Venice, and then eventually he ended up settling in 1370 in Arques. And in Arques, on July 18, 1374, he died at his home there, where his daughter took care of him in his later years. He had 2 children, both illegitimate, a son and his daughter. Throughout his life, he wrote many works, some in Latin, some in the Italian vernacular, which is a lot of his poetry, especially the poetry influenced by Laura, was written in the Italian vernacular. And those poems were compiled into the book called the Canzoniere. In the Canzoniere, you can read about how Laura inspired him, how he esteemed her, his love for her, and then even after her death, there's a bunch of the poems were written after her death, and about how he held her to such high moral and spiritual standards, and how she even inspired him even after her passing. Also in his book of Triumphs, which is also poems, in that, according to Rosenblum, you can see the power that Laura held over him, as well as poems about morality and about time. He wrote another one of his works was called My Secret. This is written in an individual voice, and this individual voice became a paradigm for later Renaissance writers like Michael de Montaigne. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. Probably not. But This My Secret was written in an individual voice, which was unique at that time. He also wrote a book without a name, which was a metrical epistle, according to Rosenbaum. He had other Latin works. In 1337, he began work on the De Viris Illustribus, which is a biographical compendium of classical and more recent figures, again according to Rosenbaum. In 1338 and 1339, he began, or around in that time, he began work on Africa, which was an epic story inspired by his love of classical literature. The main character in this epic Africa is Scorpio Africanus. Also, he was inspired by Cicero to compile letters that he wrote over his lifetime. And the compiling of these letters can be seen in 2 volumes. One is called A Book on Personal Matters, and another is called Letters of Old Age. Throughout Petrarch's writings, and he had even more than what I listed here, you can see the predominant themes of love, nature, and time, and the passage of time. His love for Laura is a largely predominant theme in a lot of his poems, especially his vernacular poems. She was a huge influential person in his life, and a lot of his writing, and a lot of the writing that he is currently known for, is the writing inspired by her. He always thought that he would be known for his Latin works, but today he is more known for his vernacular poems, such as in the Canzoniere. Petrarch used a lot of self-analysis in his work, and as a writer, he focused more on the writer or the poet themselves instead of the nature of the object of the poem, according to Colvin. In many of his writings, he's very introspective, and as well, and he's drawing inspiration from the nature all around him, according to Rosenbaum. He was a humanist in his time. He greatly wanted the Italian people, to return to the knowledge of classical education and a love for the classics, and he influenced this. Petrarch lived during the Middle Ages, but it's said that he helped usher in the Renaissance period, where there was a turning back to the classical literature and classical education. Petrarch loved books. I have a quote that Petrarch said, according to Rosenbaum. This quote was in 1346 in a letter that he wrote to Giovanni dell'Incisa, and he stated, "I am possessed by one insatiable passion, which I cannot restrain, nor would I if I could. I cannot get enough books." And through his lifetime, he created a vast a library. And at one point in 1362, he moved to Venice, and there he offered his collection to the people of Venice in return for housing. And this is a quote again from Rosenbaum of what he said. "Those of ingenious and noble men who read, who may delight in such things, is what he wanted to donate the books to in return for housing." However, the proposal fell through, and so his library was not donated to Venice. But Petrarch, according to Colvin, was a very introspective man with a very strong personality, of high intelligence and classical learning, and was an impressive writer in Italian verse. And Petrarch was a great humanicist, and love of his classical literature is what he is known for, and for ushering in the Renaissance and encouraging the people of Italy to return back to classical education, or classical literature. Thank you for listening to this presentation.